Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Dark Rhino's Security Confidential. Tonight, we are honored to have Dennis Underwood join us. Dennis is a fantastic human being, but in addition to being a fantastic human being, he's in Pittsburgh, which gives him bonus points because that's where we're at. But also, he is an entrepreneur. Dennis is a veteran. He's an expert in cryptography, and he's a cybersecurity leader. He also happens to be the CEO of Crucible. So he is kind enough to join us today and enlighten us on many topics that are going to be of interest to you folks in the world of cybersecurity. Dennis, thank you for being on the show.
Thank you for having me, Manoj. I really like this.
Hey, so Dennis, one of the things that I'd love to start off with is that you're a veteran. And we have, at Dark Rhino, we have a lot of veterans in our organization. A lot of our listeners are veterans. One of the questions that comes up is that as they are transitioning from military life to civilian life, especially if they're looking for a career in cyber, what's the guidance on how they should go about doing that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I should say, right out of the gate, that my MOS, or my specialty when I was in the military, was actually artillery. So there was nothing cybery or like signals intelligence or anything like that at all. Like, it was totally combat arms, not easily transferable. Like, I wasn't good enough to be like the Punisher, like a SEAL team guy. I was just a normal grunt. Like, I couldn't go be an assassin. But like, also, I didn't have any skills. So honestly, what I ended up doing was cyber is a great place to be for IT, because like, if you're just a normal IT person, you have to kind of memorize that Active Directory playbook, right? And then come out
Okay.
with all of that knowledge,
Yep.
right? And with cyber, your goal isn't to memorize page 44 through 46. Your goal is to break it, to do things that they say don't do, right? Which is a lot easier to do in your spare time. So I love cyber because like, you can do that. You're going to have to research on your own. Just get in the habit of doing that, right? I mean, none of us get to where we are by just doing the 8 to 5. And so during your off hours at Garrison or whatever, go ahead and research. I will tell you a cool story. So whenever I was deployed to Iraq, I realized that for Operation Iraqi Freedom in like 2003,
So you were there how long?
just over a year, like 13
Okay.
months or something like that. I was actually in country, but yeah. So I was doing combat missions and convoy missions, which arguably might not be combat, just driving around and stuff like that, right? Um, and so in between missions, I would have my SANS books, and I would always take my SANS books with me in the Humvee, right? And I'd bring it out. It would be right next to like maybe ammo or whatever else. Well, the Qurans are always like thread bound if you ever look at them. And I realized it's not just because they're so special, but what's happening was that I'd be on the side of a road, in between missions, and I'd be reading my SANS book to keep up on the firewalls and everything else, right? So I don't want my
Yep.
skills to atrophy. Part of that whole in your spare time. Well, the glue was melting on all of my SANS books because of the heat, right? The massive heat in the desert.
What was the temperature out there?
Like 130, sometimes 150. Depending on if it's inside the Humvee.
130?
Yeah, it's
Oh,
just
yeah,
pretty.
you're inside a Humvee.
Yeah, so it's pretty intense, and you'd be like driving around Iraq, or maybe taking a break, going down to Kuwait or whatever. But like, um, so chapters of the book would actually fall out, and the desert wind was always blowing, and
Oh,
so you'd
man.
actually lose. Like, it might be on like how to manage a Cisco properly, a Cisco router properly, or something. As part of your SAN certification. And it would blow away. And there were always like Iraqis around that would kind of hang out, and I don't, some wanted candy or whatever. Some were just like keeping tabs on you. And so it took me way too long to realize that, that the pages that were flying away. Well, first of all, when I got back home and started doing like, getting my lab back going and everything, and then
Yep.
transitioning out, I could actually tell what chapters I was missing, because like, I'd be like, I forget how to do that, and I'd look and I'd be like, oh, that chapter's somewhere in Iraq.
It's in the
Um,
desert.
yeah, but it was kind of cool because they would think it's like classified data or mission data or something. It all looks very technical. It's like firewall rules and stuff like that. And so they'd run away, and I try to chase them. I could never keep up with them. Like, but but they'd always take my stuff, and I'm thinking, man, I really needed chapter 4 because I want to take a cert when I get back, when I get out. So anyway, cool story about like you should have uh, you know
And so your training then in cyber, you did on your own. You weren't, the military didn't give you that tool set.
No, I actually, when I got back, I transitioned over to like a telecommunications job, and it turns out the military's, I was already on the way out, kind of, and the military's version of that was at the time stringing telephone lines and climbing up telephone poles and things like that. So I still didn't hit the mark. That was in 2005, so things are different now, But I was like, I'm gonna get into cyber before I leave, and then they put me up on a telephone pole, and I was like, that is not cyber. So.
Well, how did you, because you have an illustrious past and you got the attention of the NSA or probably some other three-letter agencies. How did that come about then?
Yeah, so again, the good thing about cyber is you're paid to break stuff, or you're getting ready to be paid to break stuff. So what happened was I had gone back to school. I was actually in graduate school at the time down at UNC Charlotte, and great at the time. I don't know now, but at the time it was great because all the banks could hire from there, right? So the Bank of America needs a lot of crypto, and
Yeah, I can understand that.
so there was an unbreakable malware, like a botnet, a peer-to-peer botnet. It was one of Configur's cousins, I guess, or something.
Okay.
The news story was that with the researchers at this university and from FBI were that this thing is unbreakable and no one can seem to get a handle on it. So I said, well, that's great because I'm training to be a cyber guy and I've done this on my own all along. So let's stand up, let's pivot my lab over. So I think what probably got their attention, I never saw this like in writing or anything, but I
Sure.
figured out a way, a weakness in their cryptography, in their peer-to-peer algorithm that would protect to say only the boss can really tell me what to do kind of thing. And
Okay.
so I figured out a weakness and I did a whole bunch of work and a whole bunch of math and stuff like that, protocol analysis. And then I came up with an Independence Day style attack on this peer-to-peer botnet that would just kind of like in the movie, just collapse the whole thing on itself. Well, it was really interesting because what happened was, and this is all like, this is the power of being able to be like that dark horse researcher on your own, where you're figuring things out. So um, I got POC code and demonstrated I could actually have the malware destroy itself. And so the dean called up someone, and next thing I know, two guys flew in from they said NORAD, for all the military folks out there, you know what that is.
Sure.
And so they flew in the same day apparently on I guess a private jet. I don't think US Air would do
You
that.
really got their attention.
I did, and it was really interesting because while I was, so the dean was trying to maneuver me out of making any money. He was trying to sell it to the government, but also take it from me.
Okay.
In the other room, it was like a soap opera. In the other room, while these guys were trying to get my stuff, right? Um, a researcher, another professor at the university, there was a global like anti-botnet kind of like peer-to-peer botnet like alias, email alias, right? And he was emailing like thousands of researchers all over the world saying, "Hey, we have a guy here who found a vulnerability in the peer-to-peer algorithm," and he gave enough detail that while these negotiations were happening and there was posturing by the dean of the college and stuff to like kind of cut me out, I was
Yeah.
watching the bad guys were actually dynamically patching their code to fix the vulnerability.
Really?
So within that 24-hour period, my code was useless. But I didn't tell anyone. So I finally had it, and I actually did this whole like it was very much like a like those Spanish language soap operas. I was kind of like, no one gets it. Then I delete the code. No one gets it.
No one get.
And no one knew that it was actually useless at that point because this researcher had naively emailed the Russians basically to say, hey, here's your vulnerability. You should probably patch this kind of
You should.
kind of thing.
Oh man.
So anyway, so that got the attention of some folks, I think. At least the people who flew in, right?
Yeah. And I'm sure that vulnerability would have been worth millions of dollars on the black market.
I would assume, yes. I'm again a plucky researcher. You don't really think about the business side, right? At that point in life, you're just.
Well, apparently, and this is from an article, this is not from personal experience, but what I read was that in the US, the 0-day brokers, if if you want to find a 0-day vulnerability, the going rate's about $3 million.
That's a nice little vacation, you know.
That is, yeah, it's a nice little vacation.
There's a lot of Motel 6.
Yeah. You know, after that happens, and if you're ever identified, you better be in a non-extraditable country. But yeah.
Yeah, start learning with Spanish or Venezuela, whatever you got to do. Yeah,
disappear into the rainforest, never pick up a mobile device again. But yeah, that's incredible. And you know, part of this, what you're speaking to, is also innovation, which is a great story. You know, nobody told you that this was not possible to do.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah. Right. And that's why I love, you know, anyone who's looking to get into it, I'm like, pick up a book, pick up 10 books, you know, just start researching and just start doing things that they say you can't do, you know, and that's the best way to become a researcher. I will say that for someone who's looking to be like a SOC analyst, you know, kind of like that entry level, looking at logs, go ahead and get your vendor certification. I definitely would say, you know, if I hadn't been able to get enough consulting work to feed the family and you know, pay the bills, I would have had to have been smart about it and do like some vendor cert for security. But I took the longer road and I said, no, let me figure out how to kind of do something more interesting, you know.
Oh, and we're very glad you did, because audience, as you guys will hear in a minute, Dennis has done some interesting things with ransomware, and you know, let's in fact transition to that for a second. So ransomware, it's in the news everywhere. You know,
Constantly.
Every day someone's getting hit, and it seems like no matter how much awareness is being generated, there's still one of the things that we see a lot is that, well, it's something that happens to other people. It won't happen to our company. There's a lot of that mentality, tons of it going around. The other one that we see is, well, we're in the cloud, so security is Microsoft's problem, it's Google's problem, it's Amazon's problem. Why do I give a shit about this? Right? That we see that myth come through all the time, right? And you know, the third thing is, well, we're protected at the endpoints. We've got what we need. We're good here. So just setting a little bit of the stage, you know, and this is coming from a lot of our work that we do in the small medium business space. So can't speak to the enterprise, but we're certainly seeing this in the SMB space. These kinds of myths propagating out there. So the question to you is, from a real expert, why is it that companies can't get their act together with ransomware?
Yes, it's really interesting. So coming from, you know, when I went to NSA, I ended up doing, there were some operations, there was also a lot of threat hunting I did, you know, and the one thing I'd seen before going there that kind of just made my, we'll say maybe more jaded, if anything, was that, you know, the bad guys seemed to always have access, you know. Every time I'd find something, it would be, oh, look, they were there for 6 months, you know. And so what I think we're seeing is, honestly, I think economics are a lot of the drivers for why the behavior changed. So we'll say they always have access, right? You know, they're getting in, they're getting into big places and small places. And the one thing about the behavior change is that there's so much data that's out there that's been stolen. I mean, look at the T-Mobile breach that's got in the news, right? Just add more. It's
T-Mobile,
a point.
Accenture was in the news, and recently the State Department.
Yeah, it just never stops, right? And so what's happened is that the data has devalued, right? Because it's the whole game of like, well, if everybody has a pile of diamonds in their backyard, then diamonds would not be worth as much, right? You know, and I'm sure you can have a De Beers executive on to talk all about that, you know, like
if it wasn't for them artificially controlling the market, that would in fact be the case, because diamonds are actually not so rare. That's aside.
Don't tell any 21-year-old trying to buy an engagement ring, right? Remember when you're broke trying to buy this big ring, you know? So I guess, you know, what happened was that the when you have the ransomware variable, all of a sudden the value of your access goes way up, because you're not only tapping into these ambiguous, bad, but not as easily defined data breach cost to the company, right? Because it really, it's hard to sometimes equate those data breach costs to an actual event, right? But looking at the quarterly reports. But for ransomware, what happens is you're removing the data, right? And you're also removing the revenue generating ability of the business. And
Yep.
now you're not just making the security guys upset. Now all of a sudden the CFO's calling because his QuickBooks or whatever accounting software he's using
Sure.
just went straight down. And so it's a very costly exercise, and it's no longer dependent on the availability of data breaches because there's tons of data out there on the quote unquote dark web, right? But what's happening is now it's like directly tied to the revenue and the assets that the business has. And so I think we have spies now that have turned into essentially sappers or bombers. Where now they're blowing things up inside the business instead of just like sitting there and slurping out data.
Yeah. And why is this problem so difficult to get under control from a business perspective?
Yeah. So
And this is, if I'd love for you to address this in the context of an executive, because an executive is thinking in a business, my IT guy is the greatest group of people on earth,
they
and
always
they've
are.
got everything under control, and yet they get shafted. So
Yeah. And it's and there's this myth, first of all, that somehow these security teams aren't doing their job or aren't competent or the IT folks aren't. And I'm like, I'll go in and I'll see these very tired group of people before or after an attack, right? And I'm just like, these guys are busting their butts, like, and it's never that they just throw caution to the wind and say, whatever, like,
right,
they're always trying their hardest. What I have found is that from like a business standpoint, so the attackers actually we actually have a document that goes through like 7 questions to ask the ransomware vendor, like if they come to you and say, like, because it's a pretty sad set of questions. But regardless, on the business side, whenever it's like the CIO up there in the boardroom trying to defend what just happened, um, the defenses, it seems like either they're missing it because they've always missed it because it takes 3 months for the vendor to catch up to actually let you find it, right? um,
right,
and then with ransomware you don't have 3 months, right?
right,
It's just an immediate impact, right? And it's business impacting impact. So either they're too slow, right? Or maybe they like I, I have a love hate with Cylance and tools like that, because they can generate, like, I can always find a data breach in Cylance, for instance, right? But
yeah,
that SOC 1, SOC 2 analyst doesn't have the skills to know how to dive into all that data and doesn't have the time, you know. And so that's a problem for businesses, right? Is that the ransomware might take 15 minutes to position and go, you don't have 3 months to try to find that. The second thing I see wrong is that, beyond the evasion and everything, is that we're actually seeing where it's a zero trust situation where, because we have our product we put out there, and then we realized very quickly that, not only are we protecting, but that the attackers have system or domain admin, and they are, like, I can't even trust the own system I'm on. Like that the hackers have totally taken it over, and so we're seeing where it's a resilience issue because zero trust. Everyone talks about zero trust from a make sure that one user is the right user. Well,
right.
it's actually, is it really the kernel telling me, the Windows kernel telling me to do this, or is it lying to me? Like, and is it a hacker telling me? And that's a problem, right? Whenever you're trying to be, you can't trust the system you're on at all, which
That
is
was
more like, I mean,
SolarWinds. Those guys up their own privileges,
yes,
right?
so SolarWinds, Kaseya, before that, ConnectWise, and they're all at high privilege, right? They're all normally whitelisted, and so it's a great place for a hacker to be. And they can run amok with whatever they want to do. I loved Kaseya. I mean, this is from a security guy, right? Again, the plucky researcher, because before Kaseya, I never actually got to respond where the antivirus and the EDRs were actually working. They were always in some way degraded or disabled because the hacker was able to nuke them. Um, with Kaseya, all of the tools were working at full capacity, you know? And so
Wow.
I was like, I finally get to see like what SEAL Team 6 looks like when they're really, when I don't blindfold them, and it was still a bit of carnage, right? But it's a great example of
Yes, it was.
talking about there.
Yeah, and I think for our audience, what Dennis, a take home here would be zero trust is not the end all and be all, because obviously, if you have elevated privileges that are trusted, well, your zero trust framework isn't exactly going to work to
Yeah,
prevent.
we one of the things that we noticed in our telemetry, which it kind of spurred a whole bunch of development on our side, was that um at first it was all like, hackerlols.exe and stuff like that were in all of our telemetry, or ryuk.exe, things like that, in terms of ransomware being run. And then we realized that it was actually a pretty quick transition. It wasn't hacker.exe anymore. It was all like Windows applications that were getting stopped, or other privileged applications. And we realized what was going on was that even with zero trust, I mean, what do you do when you trust your SharePoint server and the hacker has injected ransomware, and now your SharePoint server is doing SharePoint things, but also doing ransomware things, right? And that's zero trust won't really help you there, right? Because you're saying, oh no, that's SharePoint, that has access to the e-commerce server or whatever.
That, that's very true, and then that's also a case where I'm glad you pointed it out, that where Microsoft, even though they have great security, just because you're on their platform is not going to stop this as well.
Right, right. And I didn't touch on the cloud thing at all. Sorry. Yeah. So
No, please do, because
it's
there's let's do a little myth busting on that one. There's a lot of
absolutely.
that
So
going
so
around.
the first is not a technical problem at all. And if you ever follow, like I follow some of your posts and some of your peers, and if you look at like the risk mitigation or risk acceptance in the cloud model, um, the cloud providers make sure that you're the one accepting the risk, of security and
Absolutely,
everything else, right? Um, so
they'll
it's a,
be out
it's
of
a
business if to have it be anything else.
Exactly. Yeah, it's not their problem. And so, um, having said that, though, we do see where the ransomware. It's funny because the people think the ransomware is like targeting certain things, like they're super smart. What we find is that a lot of times the Windows libraries they use, or the other libraries they use, are made for resilient commercial operations. They're made to like help businesses, and so sometimes the ransomware will run, and depending on which library they use, it will happily connect to that server that's remote, that doesn't even have a drive letter, and it will just go ahead and access it. It's a file handle. Hey, here we go, and it doesn't care that it's like actually inside of like a Google Cloud instance or anything.
Yep,
We
that's keep going. Sorry.
Oh yeah, yeah, I'm on a roll. I had 4 cups of coffee this morning, and so it's
That's
just it's
I'm
carrying through the
working on
day.
my first cup here, so I
Nice.
apologize. It does
So
smell good. Sorry, we don't have smell-o-vision on this
it
podcast,
would be better. Yeah.
so
We
sorry,
do
Dennis.
go for it. Yeah, yeah. We do see where actually attackers will prepare the environment. From the military folks, prepare the battlefield. So if we have a ransomware that is, for instance, not all that advanced, we've actually seen where they'll run a script, and we'll say the ransomware can only encrypt things with drive letter number, drive letters like A through Z.
Okay.
They'll actually go ahead and mount that Dropbox or whatever to a drive letter, just to make sure that the ransomware hits it. So it's like you have this supply chain, right? Because you have this like ransomware hacker developer who is really good at like C, C++, and all that kind of stuff, .NET, whatever. And then you have this DevOps guy or girl, right, woman, who like can't do the C's and the C++s just to be a coder for a second. Like, but then like will but knows to mount that drive in PowerShell to make sure that the ransomware hits it too. And so we've seen that as well, which is actually
But
pretty
your SIM
interesting.
should be triggered on that big time, right? There should be some alarm bells going off in your sock as soon as someone tries to do that.
Well, I would think it's I mean, it depends on how they're configured, but these are like legitimate things, right? I mean, a user, because they've co-opted a user at that point, right, or whatever. And I think I would probably go crazy, like if Manoj, you gave me a task to like, hey, every time a user mounts their cloud instance to a drive letter, I want to know about it, and I want you to talk to them and see if it's really them. I think I'd probably last about a week, and then I'd lose my hair. It would be ugly, So um, so that's where I think it's just, yes, that could trigger something. Hey, if you see your cloud instances get mounted to a drive letter, that definitely could work. Um, the the attackers have the more modern ransomware does a better job of handling that kind of situation, So
And so the dwell times of ransomware when they're prepping the environment, there used to be an old statistic that it was like 200 plus days that people were in the
part of mine,
environment.
yeah.
So what is it currently? Have the
That
advances shortened that dwell time substantially at this point?
that's a great question. It really depends, which I know is not helpful for anyone, but we have seen this trend where they are like taking over. The automation is becoming a bigger play, where the ransomware as a service folks, that everyone, I should say everyone, some folks think it's like this elite kind of like mastermind, who's like running the show, and then I find out that it's like really it's someone who's marginally useful, who just has 20 scripts to run, and they know that hey, run these 20 scripts and it'll disable the EDRs, or firewall off the XDR, or whatever they're doing. Um, and so the dwell time can be shorter. I've noticed, if first of all, if all the scripts happen to line up. I call it speed bump security, because once the script breaks, then these people sometimes are stuck and they have to move on. But also, if they take over the Active Directory server, then I have seen where they will deploy group policy to download, install, and run the ransomware on a ton of machines at once. And at that
Oh
point,
man.
you don't really need a lot of dwell time, right? You have Active Directory doing it for you.
And what is the rate of encryption?
That's a great
Like
question. So it depends on what's being encrypted, and where it's being encrypted. And let me explain that. So the max we've seen is around 300 files per second. That's the cap per ransomware incident. Now that can be slower if you have 50 workstations all running through one switch trying to encrypt that remote server, right? Which is a common
so
scenario. So
300 files per second, is that per core, or is that just that's the flat out limit?
we did the flat out limit to make it easy. Now it's interesting you say that, because what'll happen is they'll actually tune the number of threads inside the ransomware variant, um,
Okay.
to do simultaneous. So 300 is about, I think, like 30 threads, I think is what we saw. Um, if they want to go low and slow, they can reduce that number. Some early versions of ransomware would make it like 100. The problem is that this is an old sysadmin problem, is that if you try to do too much on the system or over the network, file corruption starts happening, right? Or if the switch can't handle those 50 machines all trying to encrypt the servers, file corruption starts happening on the network layer, right? And so they have to tune it to be kind of like fast but not too fast. It's like Han Solo, like fly casual but not too casual. Um, so they'll do that. That's why they like to maneuver to the server sometimes, because once you're on the server, you might only get 100 files a second, remotely, but on the server, you can crank that thing all the way up to 11, and really, get the ransomware going. They've done something else too recently. And this goes back to part of like, why aren't things stopping this, from this perspective, is that the defenses will many times they'll come in after the fact. So I always, when I talk to a business person, I'll say, look, it's like a bad guy puts on a guard uniform in a bank, and then like he's going in and out of the safe, and he's taking money out, and then eventually someone is like, I don't think that man's really a security guard for our bank, and by then 20% of the money's gone, and so a lot of the defenses are like that, where the behavior analysis is enough money has left the bank to eventually be like, can someone check his driver's license, please?
Yeah.
Um, and so what'll end up happening is that these things will fire up. Well, if you have 20% going, what if you have like 20 guards all taking money out, right? So sometimes the ransomware attackers will actually stand up 20, or we've seen as high as 50 ransomware samples on each system, and
Wow.
you have 50 systems. And on that point, we calculated at one site that went down. We weren't there yet, of course. We got called after, but it was over 1 million files per second were actually being encrypted when it went. It was almost like a DDoS, right, where all the machines stand up at once and just
Wow.
crush the systems. So we do see that as well, and so really it comes down to you have around 100 to 200 milliseconds before damage starts. So it has to be automated, and you have to start like immediately to stop the
And
business downtime.
that is a great metric, and I want the audience to please make a note of it. You have 100 to 200 milliseconds. You talk about response time, and during the Cold War, we had 30 minutes of flight time from the Soviet Union to the United States, right?
Right.
That seems like an eternity compared to 100 to 200 milliseconds. That's faster than the blink of an eye.
Yeah, we've actually in our own product, like for like the 50 samples happening all at once, uh, we've had to, my developers came to me and said our stuff's too slow, and I said, well, we're an application, and they said, you understand that our driver in the kernel, it's too slow communicating to the service in our Windows application, that data bus on the same system is too slow, and so they were moving things into the actual driver because they had to get it faster to go down to the
Wow.
sea level. Yeah.
So let's talk about your company and your product and how you guys are actually tackling this problem. So, what's the design behind Cyber Crucible?
Yeah, so what happened, I mean, really was we had a bunch of SOC automation products, and we still have them. We realized that the ransomware was just too fast. It was too destructive, and it was too fast. And we literally had a situation where we were calling the person because we got an alert, and we were monitoring, helping them monitor. And it was like it's almost like this is a horrible analogy, but you're on your military base, and all of a sudden you find that 100 suicide bombers are scattered throughout your military base, right?
Oh
Well,
man.
you can start trying to capture them, but now you have a problem here, right? These guys are detonating as fast as they're being approached, and so we had that, and I realized there needs to be a different solution. And we looked around and realized that we actually we had a tool that would be able to capture the encryption keys being used by some remote access tools, some data breach tools, right?
Okay.
And we pivoted it for ransomware, like their early versions, and we were able to grab the encryption key and then go back and we made a bunch of automation to decrypt, right?
Oh, that must have been really upsetting to a whole bunch of people.
I got cussed out, and like I was googling, like kind of translate, like, okay, what does this mean? It's actually really interesting. There are ransomware developers and operators who are very unprofessional, and then
Oh,
there were other ones that were very professional, and it was like you and I talking. They had already reverse engineered my software. They knew how it worked down to the function name, and it was just a chat among professionals. They were very calm about it. It's really cool.
but so sorry I got you off track there. Continue
Oh yeah,
the
so
thread.
so you know how like in those Pixar movies where or like Ant-Man where like there's a big explosion, or like the
Yep.
train scene in Ant-Man where like it
Yeah.
looks like it's a real train and then it's really this little tiny thing. So without many people knowing, there was like this arms race and this battle going on over 2020 between us and the ransomware people, where they were, evading and doing trying different things, and we were red teaming our own stuff and seeing them do stuff, and of course, Microsoft was introducing bugs for both of us to deal with while that's all going on, uh, but what happened was that it was a big arms race. It was a big growth period for the ransomware maturity and for us. And where we sit now is so we have our driver. We realized that the business need, honestly, we had this really cool thing that made the attackers really angry, which was we could decrypt Ryuk in about 5 minutes. We were
Wow.
busy capturing things that might be keys, maybe, and then putting it all back together with a whole bunch of cloud computing, and saying, okay, here's our recipe, and the attackers hated it, and then we had some CIOs and CISOs over COVID, who they were like, look, I don't have a budget right now. That's good. They were open about it, and they said, but if they're kind of like, how do you put this nicely? They were frustrated that I could sit there and watch the attack happen, and then let the whole company go down, and then we could decrypt in 10 minutes, or whatever it was, right? And they were like, wait, so you watched me get robbed, and then you came in and you attacked the attacker, like, and they were like, I'm frustrated that you couldn't just stop the burglar from from being able to
Yep.
do this. So we pivoted. That's where business rules don't line up with the geekiness that is our nature, right? And
Yep.
so we actually pivoted to make it go super fast. And so now we're actually we have this really cool driver. It looks for like different things that work for the hackers, and including the ransomware behaviors, and we can authoritatively stop the ransomware. Knock on wood, we haven't been beaten yet, but it actually stops the downtime from happening, even when it's a trusted application like a Kaseya or SolarWinds.
So you're shutting down the encryption process completely then. You're not even letting it start on the processor.
Yeah, so our behavioral analytics at this point are fast enough that we have our 200 millisecond metric. So it has to be very fast decisions, right?
So you're not
So
going back to the cloud then.
we
This has
tried, we tried it. The latency is like, even at we at some point had Amazon has their like lambdas that are inside of their CDN,
Yep.
and like the super fast reaction time, the fastest we could get it still caused downtime. We had
Wow.
to go. So what happened was we couldn't use backups on the system; those get nuked. We couldn't even have like a cache. The attackers found the cache one day. I think they thought we were a competitor of ours, quite honestly, and then like deleted it. Like they corrupted it, and we were like, we needed that data. That was like our passwords for our server. But so we everything is in memory, and it's all in the driver, actually, in the kernel space. So, and then we have our behavioral models in there, and we react instantly, and we suspend the process. So technically you could carve it out and grab it. We don't know. The problem is with that is, as humans, if a SOC gets a call, or or an email from our automated notification saying, hey,
Yeah.
50 machines on your network, just someone has system, and we just shut down 50 samples of ransomware and froze them in place. um, we've learned that most folks are not there emotionally to just say, let me go ahead and calmly do a memory carve and let's start collecting
Okay.
forensics. They're on like 4 alarm fire mode.
Right.
So you know
That's that's incredible technology, and the other side knows what you're doing, and thus far they have not been able to break it, which is
Not yet. We do see some really crazy attacks, like OAuth attacks and all kind of increasing things. So it's pretty interesting. We do have, before a wave of attacks, I've kind of stopped putting on YouTube. We always had demos on YouTube. If you go on there, you can probably still see some. Well, before a wave of attacks, they'd actually have like DMs. I'm assuming it's them. Like for instance, when the hospitals with the Ryuk attacks,
yep.
3 days before the attack, we had a DMC or DCMA like takedown of our Ryuk demo, and I'm like, oh, it disappeared, and I was like, oh, let me just show the demo, and one day, and I was like, oh, it's not here anymore. It was had a takedown, and then the Ryuk guys went to town on hospitals, right? So it seems like they know we're coming, and they're trying to hide what we can do.
That means what you're doing is highly effective.
I think so. I take it as a good
That's
thing.
and that is a very good thing, and a lot of us are very grateful that folks like you are out there that are trying to make a serious dent into this problem. What one thing I wanted to ask you was, we see, every time there is a major ransomware attack that makes the news, we always get some politician on TV that comes on and says whatever nonsense they're going to say, regardless of the party involved. But one thing that we never hear from them, or at least publicly it's not put out, is that they're, you know, people, companies need to focus on, there should be some element of threat hunting in their environments. Like there needs to be something there. I think you would even agree you can't leave it all to technology. You need humans involved with this at some point in time,
Absolutely.
right? Why does that get mixed? It seems like the focus is always on the silver bullet. It's like, just find me that one technology and I'm going to rely on that technology. But why not build, as part of your, in a corporate environment, build a great threat hunting program, and that doesn't have to be 50 people. It can be a very small group of dedicated professionals that do it very
Absolutely.
well, right?
I always call it like the chaos monkey. Like just have one person that I always like it when it's like an IT admin or something, because not formally trained. Not like the expert on, I don't know, Cisco Firepower SIM. You don't want
Yeah,
that person. Like you want someone who's just like gonna poke around, just like a hacker would, and
that's
try to
right.
find. I love that, and because even us with our tools, right? Like we have some behavioral analytics that is like, why is PowerShell doing this? And we can't whitelist it and we can't blacklist it because you need PowerShell to run your business, right? And we're like, well, all we can do is kind of alert, but it takes a human to come in there and say, oh yeah,
That's right.
that was Bob, and
I
Mary
know
was
that
doing patching.
guy. He
Yeah.
does this all the time. Okay.
Right, and we whitelist actually the specific commands, but still some of the commands are the same, So some are obviously, not, but we try to remove the hiding places, but it's never foolproof. I love the threat hunting piece. I almost on the politicians and the businesses side. Um, I feel like they almost need to find a way. We need to find a way to remove the opinions, or have people disclose that, hey, I make money off of your failure. I make money off of your pain. Like, I run an ambulance, network, and I love sick people. Like that kind of, because yes, it's necessary, but it's also a conflict of interest sometimes, right? And so um, I know in our company, I always tell people, if we're helping them out, I'm like, look, our salespeople as well will say, our goal here is to get you up and running so you can install our software. Like that's our goal, and then we let them know right away, we're not here to, take you to the brink of bankruptcy on forensic analysis, and stuff,
Yeah,
and I
which
think
companies are probably familiar with after they've been hit. That bill is not cheap.
it isn't, no. And so I agree with you 100%. The threat hunting and, trying to find these guys as they're moving around and dwelling, where internally we're doing a better job now of making a lot of this raw data available to people, because there's so many folks that just need more data, and if they can get more data that's meaningful, I think they can probably do a good job, even if they're not NSA trained cryptography chaos monkeys.
So, Dennis, we're at the 2 minute mark here, and we'd really like to give you a chance to plug anything that you would like to plug, events, books, appearances, whatever you feel that you would like to make the audience aware of.
Absolutely.
Please.
So I'm here in Pittsburgh, so we're going to B-Sides Pittsburgh, and there's other B-Sides around. Love to see it. We put in for three presentations. We'll see how many get accepted. The first one is on we reverse engineered one of the ransomware protocols that they use to figure out which key to charge you the most for, how they do their inventory management. The second one is 12, and it's actually a thing. The second we did was we did 12 things that a hacker does before they run the ransomware, but after they get in position. They do a lot of
Okay.
preparation. Actually, it's good guy hacker sometimes. And then the third thing I'm doing is that I have had a heck of a time on finding accurate metrics for all the actuarials and risk management folks on the business side to say, here's what the ransomware is costing and here's how often. We even, just an example, Manoj, we found one example of a report that was quoted by a couple dozen people. The original report, they accidentally forgot a zero on their math, and then it was copy pasted and used for all kind of
Oh
derivative
man.
risk analysis. So they were off by a factor of 10. And so I'm going to go through some of that, during my presentation. So we'll see
I
what
think
happens.
that's going to be very valuable data. And the only thing I have anecdotally on that is that if you look at the cyber insurance market, it used to be, before all the wonderful world of ransomware got hot and heavy, that cyber insurance companies kept 60 cents on the dollar as profit on every dollar collected in premium.
I believe it.
That's not true anymore. In fact,
Yeah.
the payouts have exceeded the premiums, and they're dipping into their property and casualty funds to pay these, which is why people are
Right.
seeing 50, 60, 100% increases in cybersecurity insurance costs. So someone has data somewhere, or it's getting developed very quickly. But you're right, it's not readily available out there.
Right. And so as a risk manager, you can't go to your CFO and say, here is the risk we accept, and here's the risk that we have managed. And I guess the same thing's happening in insurance companies, right? Because it's a whole separate podcast, right? But whenever the insurance company loses money, that tells me that the insurance company's math is not reflective of reality. You know.
Ab- I agree with you completely. And Dennis, we're at the hour here. I'm going to really request that you come back for a part 2. I think we just have scratched the surface. If you're up for it, we'd like to dive a lot more. I know we're going to get a lot of views and interests in this topic. It's near and dear to a lot of people at this point, and we appreciate
Absolutely.
you sharing your insights.
Well, thank you so much for the time, and I'm glad I was all caffeinated so I could just kind of keep firing, you know.
Man,
So it's good.
you're awesome. Very, very enlightening conversation. Thank you, Dennis. I hope you have a great day in sunny Pittsburgh today.
Thank you so much, Manoj. Have a good day.